Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Wooldridge. I'm the CEO at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and welcome to today's webinar. I want to take the opportunity, first of all, in the spirit of reconciliation, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. I'm on Wurundjeri land and very pleased to be joining you from there, and I know people will be coming from all across the country, but many also from Canberra and that community. So in terms of what's been happening, reporting was during September and October last year. And as you will well know, it was the first time there was a requirement to report as opposed to the voluntary reporting that happened for many the year before. We did have, because it was the first time round, quite a number of challenges, quite a lot of learning. We really appreciate the feedback that we've had as well. And we did allow an extended period of time for agencies to be able to complete their reporting. And we will have a tighter process consistent with the Act for next time, but for the first time we wanted to make sure that everyone was on board, that everyone understood how it worked, and any technical or reporting challenges we were able to work through with you as well. So that meant that the executive summary and the industry benchmark report were available for download in May, earlier this month, and hopefully all of you have had the chance to do that, and there'll be some information in the chat if you haven't yet in terms of how you can go through that process. We are now working through the summary results of everything. And so we're very pleased that in June, and we expect around mid-June, we will be publishing the Commonwealth Public Sector Scorecard. And what that also will mean is that individual agency results will also be published on our Data Explorer. That's pretty critical and important step, and they will be published like other employer for the private sector information is published. Then, of course, we've announced the dates in terms of the next round of Commonwealth public sector reporting. That will be September, October again this year for the 2023 year in terms of your data. And we do plan to run a tighter process because the reporting window is a 2-month window from our Act. So we just to alert that we have an expectation that people will commence and complete reporting in that September to October period. The good news is that employer gender pay gaps will be published in early 2025, and it will relate to the reporting that happens later this year for that 2023 year. There will be no gender pay gaps published from this year in terms of the results, and that timing just reflects one, the amendments to the Act, but two, because at the moment we have a reasonable delay between the year that the data is captured and when that's reported to us. Partly to manage the flow of reporting to WGEA, and partly because we also get the upload, of course, of much of the data from a number of agencies from the APSC that allows that to happen. So that's the plan for the timeline from here. I also want to just flag that we really have appreciated the feedback that we've been getting, and it's been really important. We obviously have been a private sector focused agency for our last 10 years in terms of reporting. So the public sector, obviously, it's important that we understand the nuances and the differences, and we are working to take your feedback on board and make it clearer in our webinars and in our educational materials that the difference between the private and the public sectors. One of our challenges, just for everyone to understand, is we have over 6,000 private sector employers who report to us, and 116 public sector ones. So there's a few, it's a 10-ton elephant in terms of the private sector, and a very small number of agencies of the public sector. And over time, our objective would be, it would be great if we could be quite aligned in terms of the two lots of reporting, but for the time being, we're running the two separate processes, and we'll endeavour to make sure that we articulate the nuances and the differences. Last year, in terms of your reporting, you did receive a reporting summary on submission, and then the executive summary came later. An improvement for this year's reporting is you will get your executive summary when you submit at the time of reporting, and that will replace the reporting summary, which won't exist any further. So your first document, the executive summary, will come when you submit and complete your reporting, and then your industry benchmark report will come when we've been able to analyse across all the public sector results. We do want to speed up our response time in terms of questions for this cohort, and we're going to have some dedicated service and support there. And we're also working with the APSC in improving the data transfer process and working through the technical issues. So, as I said, really appreciate the feedback we've had. Continue, please, to do that. We want to make sure that we can make it as straightforward, understandable, easy, and informative as possible. So really appreciate the feedback you give us. So you've received two reports, and we'll take you through them today. That obviously the executive summary is a playback of the information that you have provided to us, including calculations of gender pay gap and those sorts of things. For the industry benchmark report, and we've kept that language because that's the language of the Act, that is what we have selected as the industry comparison are all public sector employers who report under this public sector reporting program, but we've divided it up by size. So if you're an employer that has 7,000 employees, you'll be compared to other public sector agencies with 5,000 or more employees. So we've used size as our comparison mechanism. We know that's not perfect, and of course there's some government businesses as well as non-corporate entities and corporate entities all mixed in as part of that. These are not public documents. These are documents for your agency, for you and for agency heads and for the governing body. But we don't publish these numbers or these comparisons. What you can do though is find on your on the Data Explorer, if you wanted to compare, if you're an agency that has comparisons to private sector employers, you can find all that information and do those comparisons, so you can create your own benchmark comparisons on our Data Explorer. And just so everyone's clear, because there's two mechanisms that and ways that you could have reported to us. We're conscious that a lot of data is already collected by the APSC through various surveys and reporting mechanisms that you have, and to try and make that as simple as possible for those agencies that report that data to the APSC already. You can elect, and just about everyone did, to have that information provided directly from the APSC. There were other questions, even if you did the APSC data transfer, that you still had to answer directly. And for those agencies that don't provide that information currently to the APSC, you were the same as the private sector and do the full range of reporting. So just wanted to sort of reinforce that there's two ways that agencies can report, and that connection, that direct reporting was required in both, but perhaps a little bit less than in other circumstances. So I just wanted to finish up on my brief comments to say it is a requirement for you to share your reports with your governing body. And whatever form that takes. Once again, that might be your executive committee in the context of your particular agency. So whatever constitutes the group that has primary responsibility for governance is the group that these documents need to be shared with. And you will be asked in reporting later this year whether you shared the reports from this year. So you'll be asked to verify that process has happened. It's not a requirement, but we are encouraging everyone to inform your portfolio or your shareholder minister in relation to your results as well in advance of them being published in mid-June. We totally leave that in your hand. But it's an opportunity to engage on these issues should you wish to. Very good. I'm going to hand back to Penelope.
Thank you, Mary, for sharing that broader context. It's really helpful to locate these reports in that broader context and purpose. I'm going to actually invite Diana to speak to how to interpret these reports, what data's in them, where it came from, and what to make of it. Diana, over to you.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about what's in the reports that you might not be aware of in relation to the data. So first up, the exec summary. It covers your key results from your submission to AGEA. So that includes information about your gender pay gap that we sometimes call your GPG, around your gender composition by pay quartile, as well as your data relating to the 6 gender equality indicators, including whether or not you have policies in place in relation to those. The report, as you may have seen, also covers a bit about why that information is important and how you can use it to start to take action or to take further action on gender equality in your workplace. So in relation to your GPG, this is in the first part of your report. And your GPG is calculated in this way. It's men's remuneration minus women's remuneration divided by men's remuneration times 100. So that then gives us the gap between men and women's pay expressed as a percentage of men's pay. And just remembering here that a positive percentage indicates that men are paid more on average in your organisation than women, and a negative percentage indicates that women are paid more. So we do that calculation the same way for both average and median gender pay gaps. And remembering as well that average is calculated by adding up all of the salaries and dividing that total by the number of employees, whereas median, we calculate that by taking the middle value, or the value at which half of your employee salaries are higher and half are lower. So we provide, as you can see in the table on the slide there, we provide your gender pay gap for both total remuneration and for base salary. So total remuneration includes base salary, but it also includes those other payments, such as things like superannuation, allowances, bonus pay, and so on. So this data that we use to calculate your GPG is reported to AGEA through that workplace profile part of your AGEA reporting. And as Mary was talking about, how some of that data comes to us via a transfer from the APSC. So in this case, that data, if you've elected to use the transfer, that data comes from your 2022 remuneration report from the APSC. And the same is true for other parts where you reported through the workplace profile. You might be wondering then how or why your gender pay gap calculated by the APSC that's provided in the state of service report is slightly different to the gender pay gap calculated by AGEA, or maybe slightly different. So both data sets, the data sets are similar in that they both include full-time earnings and part-time earnings annualized to full-time equivalent. But then there's a few key differences that I've just noted here on the slide. Mary, did you want to jump in there? Okay.
I'm happy to talk through, Diana, if
Oh no, sorry, I just saw that you had turned your mic on. Yeah, so the APSC data includes APS employees only, whereas the AGEA data set includes Commonwealth public sector employees, including those who are not APS. So that's people like the Defence Force. The APS C data uses base salary only, where with the WGEA data set, as I've said, we also look at total remuneration. And then lastly, and perhaps slightly confusingly, the APSC data set excludes the remuneration of CEOs and casual employees, whereas the WGEA data set excludes CEOs and casual managers, but we would include casual employees where these are reported directly to us via the workplace profile. But if you've used the data transfer, then obviously those casual employees are not included. The next part of your report goes through the gender composition by pay quartile. So this chart here divides your workforce into 4 equal quartiles of employees by remuneration. So the number represented here in the graph is the percentage of employees by gender. So in yellow is women and in blue is men. And I should say as well, the data on these graphs on the slide is not real. It's made up, although that is what the graph looks like. And so you can also see in the average total remuneration column on the right of the graph, that shows the average pay for each quartile, regardless of gender. So this graph is obviously a good one to have a look at if and when you're doing your gender pay gap analysis, because as you can imagine, a disproportionate number of men in the upper quartiles or women in the lower quartiles would be a key driver of a gender pay gap. And again, this data is that data from that workplace profile part of the report. And if you want more technical information about how we calculate these quartiles, all of that is available in the Gender Pay Gap Technical Guide, which is on our website, and I think is going to be shared now in the chat. And then the last part of the Executive Summary Report, it covers the 6 gender equality indicators, or GEIs as we call them. And the GEIs represent those areas where workplace gender inequality exists and where consistent action can lead to greater workplace gender equality. So public sector employers with 500 or more employees are going to be required to have a policy or strategy covering all the GEIs from 2025. So this is a really good place to start looking at how you're faring against those. So the GEIs, as you may know, are gender composition of the workforce, gender composition of governing bodies, equal remuneration between women and men, employment terms and practices relating to flexible work and support for families and caring, consultation with employees on gender equality, and sexual harassment on the ground of sex or discrimination. And so your exec summary includes data against each, and the data against GEIs 4 to 6 is purely about whether or not you have one of those policies or strategies in place. And that's something that you would have reported to WGEA through the questionnaire part of the reporting. WGEA also provides some support for developing those policies and strategies. So we've got guides against each of those 6 GEIs, and they're on our website as well. And they provide really good evidence-based best practice. And the last piece I wanted to share in relation to the exec summary is just, you may notice terms like key management personnel, managers, non-managers in the WGEA exec summary, and the APS classifications are aligned to those WGEA categories for the purposes of consistent reporting. So you can see how they align on the slide here, and that table is also presented in the back of your exec summary if you're looking for it. So now I'll just share a little bit about the industry benchmark report. And so the industry benchmark report that you will have seen as well compares your results, as Mary said, with the results of other Commonwealth public sector employers of a comparable size in what we've called a comparison group. So obviously it doesn't compare you to private sector, but if you would like to do that, you can use our data explorer, as Mary mentioned, and have a look how you compare against other industry peers who may be from the private sector. So first up in the report, your GPG or your gender pay gap is compared to your comparison groups. So in this table, your comparison group's GPG is the average and the median of the total REM and base salary for all employees in that comparison group. So we take a list of the remuneration of every employee in that whole group, and we find the average and the median for women and men and the gap. So comparing your GPG to that of other agencies can obviously help you to monitor your progress against workplace gender equality and identify priority areas for action for you as well. And this data, again, as all GPG data, comes to us via that workplace profile part of your reporting and may be transferred from the APSC. The next part of the report, we show you how your gap sits relative to your comparison group's range of gaps. So remembering that higher than 0 is a gap in favour of men and lower than 0 is a gap in favour of women. So the orange line here is your gender pay gap. So it's the average total remuneration gender pay gap. And the blue line on the graph is your comparison group's gender pay gap, but this time it's the median of all average total remuneration gender pay gaps for all employers in your comparison group. So this time we took the average total REM GPG for every employer in your group. We sorted them all from highest to lowest, and then we found the middle one. And that's what's represented here. So just note that that's slightly different to what is in the previous table. So don't be confused if those two look slightly different. And the grey box, of course, here represents your comparison group's range of GPG. So on the right is the highest GPG for your comparison group, and on the left is the lowest employer GPG in your comparison group. And the last thing I wanted to draw your attention to from the industry benchmark report is your GPG by occupational group. So the charts in this section of the report show how your average total remuneration gender pay gap for managers and non-managers compare with the comparison group. And so here we've tried to make it simple by having the red boxes highlight where your GPG is further from 0 than the average for your group. So, and that might make it an area for action for you. So in this example, the -5.5 that you can see is further from 0 than the 2.3, which is the average for the group, which is why it's highlighted in red. So the objective here is to be as close to 0 as possible. And again, as with all GPG data, it's from that workplace profile part of your report. And so we've prepared a couple of guides that help set out this information and a bunch of other information in relation to your data, where the data comes from and how it's calculated. So those are on our reporting guide as well, and we'll share them with you in the chat now. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that really helpful tour of those two key reports. There is a lot of information contained in them for your benefit and use, and you can go to those guides that Diana has just drawn your attention to go recap on some of the detail here, because there's a lot. We're also posting, of course, today's webinar and slides on our website after today, so you can refer back to these information sources where there are particular details to follow up. I'm really pleased we're getting some great questions in the chat, and we will come to those. Before we do, I wanted just to give you a sense of where to next. Now that you have these key reports, which really do give you a picture of your organisation's performance in relation to gender equality and areas for improvement that will be highlighted through those reports, where to next? We always say that the first place to start when you notice you've got a gender pay gap is to actually understand what's driving that gender pay gap by doing a gender pay gap analysis. And instructions for how you might do this are included in the gender pay gap analysis guide on our website. But key to taking action is to understand what's going on inside your organisation. And for example, common drivers of gender pay gaps are the 5 things that you see on this slide. Is it, for example, because women and men are paid differently for equal or comparable work, which is a case of unequal pay? Is it that there are many more men in leadership roles, which tend to be more highly paid, and more women in more junior roles, which tend to be lower paid, and so on? So the gender pay gap analysis guide really walks you through analysis to look at each of these 5 areas and other analysis besides, to help you really understand what's driving your gender pay gap and areas where you could focus to take action on that and improve it. So that's step 1. With this insight into your performance is to step into what's driving that gender pay gap and therefore what might we do about it. In terms of what else, and there are a couple of questions here about the scorecard, so hopefully this will answer some of those questions. The Commonwealth Public Sector Scorecard will be released publicly in mid-June. That scorecard provides an in-depth look at the aggregated data for the whole Commonwealth public sector. WGEA will also publish Commonwealth public sector employer data as employer pages on the WGEA Data Explorer. The agency will release this update at the same time as the Commonwealth public sector scorecard. So both those things happen at once. The data will include the workforce and governing body composition, so the mix of men and women in your workforce and your governing body, and also the mix of resignations, promotions and appointments data, what actions are being taken within your organisation to improve and promote gender equality, and also uptake of parental leave. And to speak directly to one of the questions in the chat, the data will not include your agency's gender pay gap. WGEA is not publishing the gender pay gaps of relevant Commonwealth employers until early 2025. And the figures we publish then will be derived from your next report to WGEA, which covers the 2023 calendar year. So we'll have another webinar on the scorecard closer to the release date in June to give you a really good sense of what's in that. Also coming up is reporting for the 2023 year. That will take place from September to October 2024. The data will be transferred from the APSC and or reported directly to the WGEA again, as Mary explained in that diagram earlier. And we'll host another webinar ahead of that reporting period to take you through changes to reporting since the last round. So stay tuned for that in September. Now, we do have some time for some questions, which we will endeavour to respond to through the team. So what I will do is I'll also pick off some of these questions that have come through the chat and share them with my colleagues here so we can give you a good response. One I can probably pick off here. Whoops, I'm scrolling through my questions. I think, Mary, you spoke to this one at the beginning about what industry peers has my report been based on? And the answer to that that Mary highlighted was it's those who are basically of a comparable size to you. And if you'd like to go and do a comparison with those doing, from what you consider to be more your peer organisations in your industry, you can do that manually using the information on Data Explorer. Let me go to some of the other questions now in the chat. And Celeste, I'm going to throw to you, if that's all right, this question that someone has posted about sorry, I'm just being lost in my scrolling here, about what specifically is being published in June, if you could kind of go directly to that person's question.
Yes, so the question I can see is what's the difference between the gender pay gap that we will publish in the future and the public sector scorecard data that we are publishing in June. In brief, the scorecard presents aggregate results across all of your employers. All of you as employers. So it would, for example, look at the gender pay gap across the whole Commonwealth public sector who reported to us. That would mean finding the difference between the average remuneration of women from all of your employers and the difference of that to men's average remuneration. When we talk about your employer gender pay gap, which we will publish in 2025, that's just looking at your own workforce. So it will present within your organisation the difference between the average earnings of women and men as opposed to the whole sector. There's also, while I'm here, a question about the Data Explorer and what will go into that. Maybe someone from our team, if they haven't already, can share a link to the Data Explorer that's already there. What you will see in the Data Explorer, it's still under development, but it will look very similar to the employer tab on that page. The only difference is that we won't provide your gender pay gap or any quartile analysis data for this year. So that will be coming in future years. So that will look at other data points, including your workforce composition, your governing body action you're taking on gender equality, but it just will exclude any gender pay gap figure and the quartile analysis for your workforce.
And Tori, I might throw to you for this question on reporting. Will there be a formal feedback survey on the 2023 reporting programme?
Yeah, so we did do a formal feedback survey at the end of January of this year, but I'm just mindful that you might have not been on the list of the reporting contacts who we sent it out to. So I'm happy to resend that out to you so that you can participate in the feedback.
Thanks so much, Tori. There's a couple of questions here that relate to obviously the industrial settings of the public sector. So non-managers being under an award and pay the same rate. Another question too I saw about the use of EAs in the APS and specific pay salary bands. I wonder, Celeste, if we can ask you to speak to how people can think about that. There's one question relates specifically to, in that context, should we be using median or mean as a suitable measure of gender pay gap? And one is around, given we've got these industrial settings that should make things equal, why are we still seeing some differences in the data?
So I think tackling the first question, both are valuable indicators that can tell you something different. At the moment in the gender pay gap calculation, your agency head remuneration will be excluded. And that's why we present to you the median, because that's less influenced by the exclusion of highly paid individuals. But once we have CEO remuneration included in the data set, then we will be presenting, well, we already present average and median, but you might see a bit of a shift because of the inclusion of that highly paid individual. In terms of gender equality in industrial settings, the gender pay gap looks at structural conditions, not just like-for-like pay. So you might see that there are gender pay gaps that exist in your workplace, even when everyone is paid on an industrial agreement, everyone's paid on pay bands. There's a few things that can contribute to that. One is the inclusion of discretionary payments like bonuses, or other allowances. And the other is the composition of your workforce. So looking at women and men at different levels and pay scales within your workforce can help you to take a look at what's happening in terms of gender equality in your workplace. I think there was some really interesting research done by the APSC that indicated that inequality, or the increase of women in lower APS pay bands, is contributing more significantly to the gender pay gap in the public service than the lack of women in leadership roles. So that's the kind of analysis you can do in your workplace, and to take a look at what's going on in terms of gender equality and what's driving that gender pay gap.
Thank you, Celeste. And I might just jump in there too on a related question from Todd about, do we have top drivers for gender pay gap where the base salary is in favour of women, but the total REM GPG is favourable to men? And the answer really is what Celeste was saying there. If there's discretionary pay that's tending more to go to men than women, that could be the driver of your gender pay gap, or one of the drivers. And when that is addressed in our gender pay gap analysis guide, so it'll kind of walk you through there's key analyses to do, and having kind of landed on some insight there, what are some of the key considerations to bear in mind about what could be driving it? And we do speak to that specific example. So thank you for that question, Todd. I can see someone's got their hand up, and I want to make sure we come to your question. So if you can please pop your question into the chat, into the Q&A, then we can come to it there. Mary, I'm wondering, there's a question about the APSC initiatives. So I'm just going to go to Amber's question and see if you can address this one, Mary. When assessing the public sector against the GEIs, will WGEA take into consideration that most, if not all, agencies often leverage the APS initiatives and the Public Sector Act? I'm specifically thinking about the requirement to have a strategy or policy for remuneration when we all have enterprise agreements and follow the APSC gender equity strategy if we don't have one of our own. So that relationship between what's done at the organisational level on strategies and policies, given that the APSC is working at that level.
And we take what you have told us in terms of your strategies and policies across the GEIs, and that is what is reflected in the Data Explorer. But of course, often there is a broader context. And so certainly in the scorecard, we acknowledge those broader contexts in relation to the results that we see. I'm actually just going to ask Celeste a question that might help answer this is, Celeste, did we advise people that if they were relying on the APSC strategy or broader government strategies or EA agreements to reflect in their own reporting, or not answer that specifically?
Yeah, so in the reports from last year, wherever there was a question about policy or strategy and where there is existing APSC or sector-wide strategies in place, there is an option to indicate that. And we have counted that as you having a policy or strategy in place. Although what we'd really love to see is people taking that sector-wide policy and strategy and developing it into an action plan so that it is specific to their workplace. The other thing that I might add is that it's a really exciting time because the centralised bargaining will change things a lot. So this last round of reporting that you've all done is almost like a baseline from which we can hopefully see positive developments that have come from the centralised bargaining too.
Thank you. There's a question here too, sort of taking us back to Diana's part of the webinar today, to please clarify that difference again between the WGEA gender pay gap and the one calculated by the APSC. So wondering, Diana, if we can kind of reiterate those points again, because it is important people feel confident they understand the difference there.
Sure, I can. I think they wanted to see the table on the slide, which I can grab up for us as well. I believe it's this one here. So yeah, as I said, I think these are the three key differences here. So it's the difference between all APS employees compared to all Commonwealth public sector employees. So there are obviously Commonwealth public sector employees who aren't APS. So that's covered in the APSC and not in our data set. And APSC, and this is a significant one, only calculates using base salary and not total REM as we do. So that'll also drive the difference. And then there's that slight difference driven by whether or not casual employees are included. So they are included where you report direct to us, but not if the data comes from the APSC transfer. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add about those differences that might help elucidate that more.
I think that was great, Diana. And as I mentioned, we'll put all this information on our website as well, along with those explainer guides that you referenced and that we have links to through the Q&A chat as well. So people can refer back to those resources later. We might keep the slides just for 1 second to answer another question. Someone was asking about the scorecard. So I think it's one of our last slides. What's in the public sector scorecard and Data Explorer? People wanting to be really clear that they understand what's going up there. It might be slide 34. Thank you. So just to reiterate, the public sector scorecard is the aggregated data for the whole Commonwealth public sector. So, and that's going to be released in mid-June. And that shows you, walks through each of those 6 gender equality indicators with the data for the whole of the Commonwealth public sector. So at the same time as that happens, we will also release data onto the Data Explorer, which is available from our website. And people can look at individual industries there and individual employers as well. So the data that will be on Data Explorer at the individual employer level, so your agency or department level, is the composition of your workforce and governing body, the data on resignations, promotions and appointments, and actions taken to promote gender equality plus uptake of parental leave. And as Celeste indicated, this year will not include your agency's gender pay gap. So hopefully that's clear. Again, this will all be on our website for people to refer back to. And we'll have a lot more information about the scorecard coming out around that time in mid-June when it's released. So we'll be able to share more detail and clarify further there as needed.
Now, perhaps I could just jump in with a practical. If people want to see what's going to be published, jump on the Data Explorer now and go to employer results, and you'll see in that slide that there's actually 6 tabs which relate to the 6 GEIs. And your information will be exactly the same as the information that is currently there for private sector employers. The one bit that we won't have under the first tab, which is equal remuneration, the gender pay gap, it will be blank in relation to the gender pay gap calculation. But if you want to see exactly what's going up, go on to what's there now, and you'll see private sector employers with their results, which will reflect what yours will be.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mary. I think we've had lots of great feedback mostly from the private sector who've been using it for a bit longer on this revamped Data Explorer. So people have found it's quite useful just to get to know what's in there and get to know how to manipulate it so that they can then use it to generate the insights that can help them explain to their stakeholders what's driving their gender pay gaps, how they compare with peers, and also how they compare in terms of the actions they're taking on gender equality. So it's a great resource. So there's a question I'd like to go to next. Do we need to provide an employer statement for the data that is published in mid-June? And is there a set date this data will be published? The employer statements are not mandatory. You don't need to complete one. Many have decided it's actually quite useful. And not only is it useful to explain to stakeholders how they understand their progress and challenges on gender equality and importantly what they're doing about them, they found it a useful process to go through to do that thinking themselves and to make sure that the right senior stakeholders have been involved in that thinking and can speak to that with great certainty. So it's been a very useful exercise for those who've done it. And the fact of its usefulness is demonstrated by the fact that while not everyone had one ready to go when we published gender pay gaps for the private sector back in February, a lot of employers subsequently did actually come to that post-publishing because they saw the value or they experienced the value of having a point of view that they could share on that and going through the process to get there. Anything, Celeste, that you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, so the employer statements are specifically to accompany the publication of your organisation's gender pay gap. So you won't be, there's no employer statement needed for the June data because your organisation's gender pay gap isn't being published, but it may help you to communicate the results of your reporting to your minister or in different parts of your organisation.
Thanks, Celeste. It's a good question too about publishing data on non-binary employees, analysis on how gender equality is working in relation to non-binary employees. This is something we think about a lot. We're doing some active work on how we might do such analysis. It's not done currently because it's not because we don't collect that data in a mandatory way. Some people choose to report that to us, but we don't have a good data set on that. We have looked at, if we did include those who voluntarily told us about that, what would it look like? And the numbers are too small to be significant. So we haven't got a useful analysis that we can share on that. But it's an area of very active work. And Mary, you may want to speak to that more in the context of the broader policy environment.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. We're very conscious of it, which is why we enable non-binary employees to be reported. We want to capture that. There is actually a recommendation with government, which government has accepted to support us broadening the definition of gender, which is currently just men and women in our Act, to include a full definition of gender consistent with how the ABS, for example, define gender. And there's a lot of work happening to progress that. And I'm optimistic that that will be something that we will be including in our data sets in the not too distant future. It's fair to say, I think the data collection in the public sector is much further advanced than it is in the private sector. And some private sector employers do, but many don't collect a broader definition of gender. So we're working on all fronts to progress that and be able to more fully reflect the broad range of genders in terms of our employees.
Thank you, Mary. I'm just scanning through the question and answer section, and I think that we have answered everyone's questions, which is great, unless, Tina, I'm missing any questions that I'm not seeing.
No, I've got one I've spotted that from Nathan, that will women taking more leave at half pay or leave without pay flow through in the data as one of the drivers of the gender pay gap? I'm happy to talk that. Or Celeste, do you want to talk to how we deal with part-time employees or employees with no pay?
Yeah, so employees who received no pay for the full year are excluded from the gender pay gap calculation. In terms of if they've worked part-time or part of the year, their remuneration is annualised to a full-time equivalent salary. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Mary?
No, I think that's the main thing. It's just so that we make it all equivalent, so that it is not skewed by part-time employees' remuneration. It's a fair and equal comparison. And APSC do that, use our methodology for the calculations of their gender pay gaps as well, so that there's consistency.
Thank you.
A couple of other recent ones. Penelope, have you spotted them, or do you want me to?
No, I think I might be experiencing some technical challenges. So if you see them, please go for it, Mary.
So this question, is there a template letter we should use to inform our shareholder minister of the results? We haven't done that. And we're happy to, probably in the timing we've got now, we'll leave it with you in terms of that information. It could be as straightforward as attaching your executive summary, and if you choose to, or your industry benchmark report with a cover note. In all of these contexts, whether it's an employer statement or the informing the minister, our view is it creates a perfect opportunity to not only articulate what the numbers are, but also a reflection of what you know to be driving those numbers and those results, and what ideas you have in place to start to address them. Now, for some agencies, that work may not have yet been undertaken. And once again, as Penelope said, there's some advice and guidance on our website about how you go about that process. So if that thinking or context is not available, then I think even just flagging that there's a plan to do that thinking and that work is very helpful. So I would, I suppose, take the opportunity to be as positive about sort of the where to from here, as well as the absolute results in the context.
Thank you.
And probably one other, and I'm happy to, Celeste, you may have covered this, is what do you see as the main limitations on using sort of what has more impact, the mean or the median GPG? And probably kick it off by saying they measure different things, and that's why we actually include both. The median obviously is about the most common remuneration, whereas the median actually takes into account the spread. And ultimately, we do talk about a target range of plus or minus 5% on a gender pay gap. And ideally, both the median and the mean would be within that plus or minus 5% range, with the conversion to zero, obviously the ultimate objective. So, we use both because we think both are valuable, and looking at one without the other provides a little less insight into the experience of your employees in your workplace. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add any other thoughts on mean or median.
just to say, I guess, some experience from the private sector that might be useful to consider is a lot of organisations do both, because as Mary says, they tell us different things, and that can be part of the process of actually understanding what's driving your gender pay gap. So, it's often useful to do both and see which is most helpful in your context, both in terms of shedding light on what's going on, and then also in terms of tracking progress on improving it. There's a question about policies and the reporting year ahead. When in 2025 are we publishing, and when in 2025 are they obliged to have a policy by? Mary, when you can speak to.
Okay. The policies actually should be in place by now, and we'll be asking in reporting later this year and testing against that. And I see Tori nodding as leading our reporting process. The expectation is that you have the policies in place and you can draw from them from the APSC or the broader context, or and be adjusting them yourself. And as Penelope said, there's some guidance from us in terms of what good policies look like in quite comprehensively. So certainly encourage you, if you have 500 or more employees, to be looking at that now. And so in September and October, you're going to be able to answer that positively in terms of those outcomes. In terms of publishing, we will see how the reporting goes. So I think that it is unlikely that we will publish the public sector gender pay gaps at the same time as the private sector. We're hoping that the reporting process will be much smoother than with the second time around, rather than it was this year. But as I said right at the beginning, we did take some extra time to make sure everyone could report, and we were thrilled. Of the 116 agencies that were required to report, we had 116 agencies report. It's an excellent result from the public sector, and we really appreciate everyone's efforts. But we're leaving ourselves a bit of flexibility in terms of making sure that it can complete again this year. And we will both notify you in advance of when we're going to release the scorecard, and when your information will be published. We'll give you, said mid-June, we'll give you a little bit of notice prior to that actually happening. And likewise, we will obviously be communicating well in advance, so you know when your gender pay gaps will be published early next year.